Good morning and happy Sunday. It's our KYJ letter L today. Letter L. Let's get started. Okay, our first letter L is lactose. You hear a lot about lactose intolerance. You might be lactose intolerant yourself. You may have never been lactose intolerant, and then you sort of got towards your autumn years of life and you've started to develop lactose intolerance. Let's talk about lactose. Lactose is one of our simple sugars. So if we have a look at all of our carbohydrates are sort of bunched into groups. They are large carbon molecules called polysaccharides. We commonly call those ones starches. Then we have oligosaccharides, and they've got between 3 and 6 different simple sugars, all sort of joined together, oligosaccharides. Then we come to disaccharides, and that's 2 simple sugars joined together. And then monosaccharides, and monosaccharides are small enough for us to be able to absorb. So all of the others, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides, we've got to break those down in our digestion. And one of those important disaccharides, double sugars, is when I take a molecule of glucose and I join it to a molecule of galactose, then I have a sugar that comes in dairy called lactose. Now, there's an enzyme in our digestion that has to be produced, usually by our pancreas, called lactase, and lactase splits the lactose into 2. So now I've got a galactose molecule and a glucose molecule. They're small enough to be able to absorb and go into our physiology. Glucose becomes fuel. Galactose usually becomes just stored straight to fat until we need it again. Don't drink too much milk. Anyhow, so if you are lacking that lactase enzyme, you're probably lactose intolerant, meaning you can't split that lactose molecule. Lactose, it's one of our disaccharides or double sugars. One glucose, one galactose, bonded together, needs to be broken in half before we can digest it properly. Okay, and if you are following to this point and we've just done lactose, you're probably going, well, what about lactate? We seem to measure lactate a lot in everybody. Everyone who's got sepsis, we measure a lactate. Everyone in shock, we measure a lactate. If we can't think of what to do next in medicine, we measure a lactate. What is lactate? Well, lactate's actually produced by your cells in an anaerobic oxygen pathway, or anaerobic without oxygen pathway. So let's talk about where lactate usually comes from in cell metabolism. It's simple, don't zone out on me now. Okay, so glucose goes into a cell, it splits into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Then if oxygen is present, that pyruvic acid and oxygen enters mitochondria and makes ATP, energy. You need oxygen to burn the pyruvic acid. So what if you're in shock, or sepsis, cardiogenic shock, neurogenic shock, hypovolemia, severely dehydrated? What if you've got any state of badness where oxygen delivery to your tissues is really poor? Well, that pyruvic acid can't be burned in an oxidative process, like the Krebs cycle. So it accumulates inside your cell until such time as it now starts to diffuse out of the cell. The pyruvic acid, as it diffuses out of the cell, picks up 2 hydrogen molecules in your juicy water around every cell and converts into lactate. When that diffuses into the blood, your lactate level rises. So under normal circumstances, your lactate should be about 0.5 to 1 millimole per litre of blood. That's not a lot of lactate, that's like a trace amount. The lactate that's already in your blood is almost certainly put there by red blood cells, because they don't use aerobic metabolism to do their thing. They get their energy straight through anaerobic pathways. That's another whole discussion. So they produce a little bit of lactic acid. That's in your blood right now, 0.5 to 1 millimole per litre, standard lactate number. But as you can appreciate, if I go into shock and I've got a global cellular hypoxia, or if I'm septic and I'm hypoxic globally, then I'm going to start producing massive amounts of lactate because I just can't burn my pyruvic acid if I'm hypoxic. So lactate gets produced, lactate accumulates. And as lactate starts to accumulate in the blood, we measure it by doing a lactate level. It's an indicator of shock. It's an indicator of depth of sepsis. It's a prognostic marker more so than a diagnostic marker. I'm hoping that you can identify someone in shock before you have to do a lactate level. But it kind of gives us a bit of a barometer as to how deep their shock state is. Lactate. What I talk a lot about in my immunology education series is leukotrienes. Leuko means white, triene. I don't really know what triene means. I think it means to go between or to communicate with. But leukotrienes are chemicals that white blood cells make and utilise to be able to communicate with each other. So, you know, if you've got eosinophils that want to talk to macrophages, and macrophages want to talk to T cells, and T cells want to talk to B cells, and B cells want to talk to lymphocytes, other lymphocytes, and neutrophils, and basophils, and mast cells, if they all want to sort of talk to each other, you know, and coordinate an immune response, they do that with a group of inflammatory chemicals collectively called cytokines, and leukotrienes is one of those proteins that they produce as a communication language, like a chemical language, to be able to talk to one another to coordinate an inflammatory process. Leukotrienes offer a lot of promise, or our understanding of leukotrienes offer a lot of promise in immunotherapy. If I wanted to shut down certain leukotrienes, then I can control some immune-mediated disease states like asthma or rheumatoid arthritis or any of the autoimmune sort of diseases. So targeting and switching on or switching off certain leukotrienes and other chemicals from white blood cells like interleukins helps us to mediate or modulate an immune response. Leukotrienes, white blood cell language, essentially. I don't normally like to do trade names for drugs, but Lasix, everyone's heard of Lasix. Furosemide, it's one of our loop diuretics. And so the loop, that could be our L, or Lasix could be our L, but let's make it Lasix that works in the loop. It's a loop diuretic, an example of a loop diuretic. And this is a medication that's going to work in the loop of Henle as a medication that allows you to reabsorb sodium and potassium and chloride back into the bloodstream where water follows within the loop. Now the medication blocks that. So if you're taking Lasix, you're blocking that reabsorbing of sodium, potassium and chloride, and therefore subsequently water. If I don't block that, I pee out those electrolytes, and if I pee out those electrolytes, water follows like a little puppy. You might remember when we did D for diuretics, Lasix is called Lasix because it lasts 6 hours. So if you have to give it twice a day, for the love of God, give it early in the morning, like 6 a.m. and midday. Don't give it 8 o'clock at night and 8 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, you're not going to be liked. Lasix in the loop of Henle, loop diuretic. Bit of an immunology theme in this L series. What about leukocyte? Leuko, remember, means white, cyte means cell. Leukocyte is just a generic name for leukocytes. Now, grab a pen, this is going to be helpful. 60% of all of your leukocytes are neutrophils. That starts with N. 30% are lymphocytes. They're your T cells and your B cells. About 30% lymphocytes. 6%, they're monocytes or macrophages. 3%, that's your eosinophils. They sort of handle allergy and parasitic infestation. And just 1%, they're your basophils. Most of them are in your tissues, so we can't measure them in blood. They're called mast cells when they're in the tissues, but basophils. So 60, 30, 6, 3, 1. 60, 30, 6, 3, 1. They're your percentages of leukocytes in your blood. You've just got to remember the order. So neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils. Have you written those down? Now look at the first letter. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Leukocytes, white blood cells, fighting infection, fighting cancer, fighting viruses, and fighting parasites, leukocytes.